Hello there, and welcome to Unit 3, where we will be discussing feedstuffs that are used in livestock diets. We'll give you some information into a number of different feed categories, just some examples of certain feeds, a little bit on the characteristics that they provide. We'll talk about forages, hay baling, storage, and feed processing. I'll let you take a quick glimpse at the objectives that we hope to accomplish in this particular unit here. When we look at first things first, feeds have what we call a common language or an international feed name. And if you look in your textbook in the center sections there, that's how they are all listed, with a particular feed number and then a name for each particular feed. It is derived out of these six things here: the origin of the material, the parts of the material that might be used as feed. For example, the soybean hull, it will list actually that one in particular, or extracted or extruded soybeans, which would relate to the processing or treatment that it might go under. The stage of maturity, especially if we're talking hay, it actually will break out grass hay mid-bloom or something like that. And then some feeds are broken out by cutting, and then certainly grade. Like number 2 yellow corn is typically classified in that particular manner. So there's that way when we're talking about from an international perspective, there's kind of a common language that everyone uses across the board. Very quickly, 8 classes of feeds, and again they're grouped by origin and characteristics. And the first one that we'll hit on, and then in some subsequent slides we'll give you some more detail on these. But first things first, the dry forages, which are of course cut and cured feeds. Generally speaking, crude fiber characteristics greater than 18%. Pretty low net energy as far as they go. And they could be carbonaceous or proteinaceous, which is to say they are a carbohydrate type feed or a protein type feed. And we'll get into that as we look at those in more detail. Of course, then we can have pasture, range, or fresh feed, and those will include your pasture grasses and green chop, which we'll cover later on. Silages, which is anything ensiled and fermented, again carbonaceous or proteinaceous depending on their major characteristic. Energy feeds, generally speaking, when we categorize anything as an energy feed, it is less than 20% crude protein and less than 18% crude fiber. So again, carbohydrates, there's a number of different byproduct feeds that fit into this category as well. Protein feeds then. In order to be categorized as a protein feed, it would need to carry greater than 20% crude protein. And it can be animal or vegetable in origin. So we'll give you a number of different options to kind of think about whenever we get to that slide. Number 6 is mineral feeds, and generally they're only fed for that specific mineral content. Things like dicalcium phosphate or magnesium oxide. Vitamin feeds, again, only fed for specific vitamin contributions. And then there's a whole class of additives, fed for a very specific purpose to enhance the ration in terms of performance or health or efficiency or something like that. We will actually discuss additives in detail in its own unit later on. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about dry forages. And 3 of them that kind of come to the surface right away is alfalfa hay, grass hay, and straw. So alfalfa hay, of course, from a dry baled hay perspective, is probably going to carry somewhere between 15 and 25% crude protein. Now, that's a very, very wide range, and that is all related to at what stage that you mow it down and make hay out of it. So the earlier in the early bud stage that you might be mowing it down, you're going to get to the upper end of that crude protein spectrum. If you see all the purple flowers like what's in the picture, you're probably going to be down to the 15% crude protein range. Depending on how aggressively you are mowing hay, somewhere between 2 and 6 cuttings per year. And here in southern Illinois, depending on the summer, it's quite possible to get 6. Grass hays then would include things like orchard grass, timothy, brome, or fescue. And a pretty wide range again, 8 to 18% crude protein again. Totally reliant and dependent upon at what stage and what the height of growth that you mow hay down. So it can make really high protein feed if you mow it at immature stages. So 2 to 3 cuttings per year of that, depending on what you tend to do. And then straw should be included in this dry forage category. It's a of course, very high fiber feed, about 4% crude protein, and it's great filler for dietary control measures, diluting down the carbohydrate load. So it's an excellent feed source for a number of reasons, in addition to its, of course, advantages for bedding. Let's spend a moment talking about then pasture and range grasses, and you'll see some things reappear here when we talk about brome, timothy, orchard grass, and fescue. Other things you might think about would be rye, Kentucky bluegrass, a number of different things in here. Timothy, again, a very, very great grass. It's very, very highly palatable. It's a good cool season grass. Somewhere between 8 and 12% crude protein. I think you can push that to the higher end a little bit most of the time. The problem is it's very poorly persistent in a pasture situation. It doesn't handle foot traffic well, and it certainly doesn't like mud. And as soon as it gets hot, timothy tends to give up a little bit. Orchard grass, very, very common. Clump grass that grows to 2 to 4 feet in height. Another cool season grass, so it comes on in the fairly early spring. Pretty similar crude protein range, and it's a great partner grass with a number of other things. So oftentimes when you seed pasture or grass hay fields, you're going to seed orchard grass with timothy, perhaps even with fescue, or maybe even with brome. Speaking of brome, another tall, growthy, very broad-leaved kind of grass, a little bit warmer season. It's not a full warm season grass unless you get a specific species, but to the warmer side of those grasses. And then fescue, which is extremely common around here. It's very, very aggressive, and given time, it will dominate your pasture and range. When it matures, it's really, really poor quality. It gets very stemmy, but it yields a lot. And so it tends to be on the lower end of the crude protein ranges. But it will work for cheap hay if done well. Let's talk silages for a minute. And so we're thinking about anything with moisture, fiber that's allowed to ferment. So in particular, and the king of all silages is corn silage. It's the most popular by a long, long way. It's very, very highly palatable. It's almost impossible to make terrible corn silage unless you put it up at the absolute wrong moisture and don't store it well. Medium to high carbohydrate loads, depending on how much grain content that you have, but pretty low crude protein. In fact, about 10% crude protein would probably catch it most of the time. Alfalfa haylage, again, can be very, very high in crude protein. And we're talking 20 to 24% range. And when you do it well, it's extremely, extremely palatable. But, of course, I throw the variability in there. Really good haylage is very difficult to make and very difficult to make well and make consistently. And so some producers get very frustrated with it because of its difficulty to do correctly. Haylage is going to have a pretty low carbohydrate profile, so you're going to have to supplement it. And haylage and corn silage pair well in the diet if we're talking about TMRs for dairy cattle. Oat and wheat silages, again, great substitutes or can extend for corn silage needs. Sometimes seeded in the fall and chopped before frost. It just depends on how you want to go about it. Wheat, kind of an early season crop in the springtime. But again, pretty high carbohydrate profile and a fairly low crude protein profile, just depending on what you've got out there. But it can be fairly decent. We'll talk about storing silage and its importance later on in our discussions here. Let's hit on some energy feeds very quickly. Again, high energy, low fiber, generally speaking, very low protein, both in quality and consistently, generally low in calcium, so we'll have to supplement there, and some moderate to high phosphorus loads. And of course, the one that comes right to the front is corn. Corn carries about 80% total digestible nutrients and about 8 to 9% crude protein. And it's fed in a variety of ways, whether it's whole, ground, cracked, steam flaked, crimped, all of those options come into play. Oats is another example that we'll throw out here. I've got a picture of steam flaked oats. A little bit lower energy profile than corn, but a touch higher crude protein. Extremely, extremely palatable, but expensive to feed. I thought I'd throw in a byproduct here of dried beet pulp. This is sugarcane in the picture. Similar energy profile to oats. A little bit lower crude protein. It's very, very tasty, but it's quite expensive to feed. Other options that you might find in this category are dried bakery product, wheat, sorghum, etc. Any of your cereal grains would fit in here. Next slide, let's talk about protein feeds for a second. Here's where all the expensive stuff starts to come in. And I gave you just a few examples here of soybean meal, which is going to be about 48% crude protein, and it's the most common crude protein feed. Similar energy to corn, actually, and it's the #1 crude protein feed, not only because of its availability and economics, but it also has a very, very broad amino acid profile, so it's a great place to start from. Included here would be blood meal, about 80% crude protein, fish meal in that 70% range, cottonseed meal about 41%, whey protein down here at 11%, which is really, really highly palatable. We'll spray whey protein on pellets at times, especially for young baby pigs, in order to get them to eat it. So it's not extremely high in protein, but very, very effective feed. Kind of getting towards the end of our first segment here. Some mineral and vitamin feeds, and this is nowhere near a complete list. But calcium sources, we're generally talking about limestone or calcium carbonate. Magnesium, mag oxide. Phosphorus sources, the most common one is dicalcium phosphate. You'll see trace mineralized salt mixes, vitamin A, D, E mixes to cover your vitamin needs. Just straight regular white salt, which is kind of what's pictured here. Zinc oxide for your zinc needs, and selenium. So a number of different options here, and again, this is an abbreviated list, but gives you an idea of some of the things that we might be considering. Some other very common feeds and stuff that, dependent upon where you are, there's a number of different byproducts available and that might fit at the right cost. Things like corn gluten meal or feed. Dried distillers grains with solubles, DDGs, is a very, very common feed around here. Brewer's grain didn't make the list here, but with our proximity to the Budweiser Brewery in St. Louis, you can get that. Wheat middlings, soybean hulls. You see different profiles here that, depending on the cost and the availability, might be great fits for you. So let's take a time out, and we'll resume with the next segment. Thanks for listening in.